All right. Good morning again, everyone. It's Lacey and Laura, and we are ready to cook transparent pudding with you. So, Laura, are you ready for me to drop that recipe up on screen so we can take a look at it?
Yes, please.
All right. Fantastic. Give me just 1 second. I'm excited about this one. It's been fun testing it and tasting it and seeing how it works.
Yeah, and it's a bit different than the last two recipes we've done. As we hunt for recipes to use in our programs, we always try to keep our eyes open for some unusual recipes that may not have modern equivalents that our 21st century audience is used to. And this definitely falls in that category. Luckily, it's not difficult to make. It's just a little bit of an oddball. And it's interesting because, we have this recipe that is labeled as a pudding. And as you read through this 18th century, recipe, you may notice we're going to put it into what's essentially a pie crust. Today, we're going to use puff pastry. So we're not making our own from scratch. Oh,
Laura, you're good.
Okay. And so you may be thinking like, well, we don't think of puddings as being something that goes in a pie crust. We tend to think of puddings as a dessert item, usually chocolate or vanilla. In the 18th century, it's just a completely different kind of dish. It can be sweet, it can be savory. In fact, we are looking at our next grouping of History in the Kitchens, possibly doing one of our savory puddings, looking at a chicken pudding. And we decided for this one that we'd pick out one of the sweeter ones. But as you look at our recipe, you'll notice it calls for 8 eggs. So this is very eggy, but it also calls for sugar and butter and nutmeg, of course. So this is something that the Masons could have as a side dish or a corner dish on their table at a dinner. And this is something that would supplement other dishes at the table for a really large formal occasion. Now, today we have modified the recipe for you. We've translated it for you. So my coworker, I'm looking at my other laptop here for a second, is going to pop up our ingredients list and we'll get started.
I've also dropped the recipe into the chat. So if you haven't already had a chance to download it, you can do that direct from the chat.
Perfect. 1 second. There we go. So we're going to get started. So I'll walk you through our ingredients. And the first thing I'm actually going to talk about is the eggs. So I mentioned we have a whole bunch of eggs. So we have 8 eggs. We also have a cup of butter, which is 2 sticks. We have sugar, whole bunch of it. And we also have nutmeg. Now I have more nutmeg in this bowl than a teaspoon, but nutmeg is one of those things that you can absolutely adjust to your own taste. So if you decide that a teaspoon is simply not enough for you, you can of course always add more. Now the first thing I'm going to do is start melting this butter. So I'm actually going to cut it up into some slightly smaller pieces and drop it into my pot here. And I'm just going to turn it on a nice low temp so it can start to melt, but we don't want it to get to the point where it starts to bubble and cook. We just want to melt it. So, and this is slightly warm butter. It's not perfectly, it was frozen butter that we left sitting out. So we're not doing this from cold butter. So it'll go a little bit quicker, but if your butter is cold, that's absolutely fine. You may find it just takes you slightly longer to warm it up. Now, while that butter is warming, we're going to get started on our eggs. And we're going to crack all of our eggs. And I've got a nice big bowl for them. So that way we have plenty of room for mixing. And I'm going to get my trash can so I can just drop shells right on in. And hopefully this doesn't need to be fancy.
It's a way of raising eggs
Now, when we look at recipes for items that we sort of classify as things that the Masons would have eaten, these tend to be in the realm of things that are kind of luxurious. And one of the things that makes this luxurious is the use of so many eggs and so much sugar and so much butter and nutmeg, which was an imported spice. And so these kind of recipes are things that maybe poor people, maybe the average working person can have like once a year, twice a year for special occasions. But the Masons are serving stuff like this all the time because they have access to this. For them, this is something that they can afford. And so they want to put it on their table as often as possible. I'm going to wash my hands real quick because we want to have food safety.
And while Laura is doing that, I can see we have some young friends joining us. Now is a great time for those young friends. Once you get all those eggs cracked, you need to be a little gentle, but you can beat the eggs because you want to mix them all together.
And you can use a whisk or you can use a fork. I'm going to use a fork today. That's just
How's our butter,
what I happen to
Laura?
have on hand.
How's our butter doing, Laura?
Oh, it's doing pretty good. Let me actually.
Can we see it on camera?
Yeah. So you can see it's starting to melt. I still got chunks in there, but it is starting to soften up and melt a bit. In fact, if I wanted to, I could cut these up a bit smaller, which I think I will go ahead and do. And cutting it smaller just helps it go a little bit quicker. It has more surface area. Of course, if you are doing it from frozen, it can be a little tough to cut the butter. So just keep that in mind. If your butter is already a little bit softened, it'll be easier on you. There we go. And then we're just going to keep an eye on that butter. Like I said, I've got it on a pretty low temp, so it shouldn't overcook at all. But it's still a good idea to keep your eyes on it. And for the eggs, I want to mix these eggs nice and well. Really make sure everything's all mixed together. I kind of start by breaking up the yolks and then I just have at it. And so I'll show you in a minute once I feel like I've got it to where I want it. Want it kind of light and fluffy. You can kind of see some bubbles popping up in it because you're introducing quite a bit of air into it.
So whisk, 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 whisk. Lots of whisking.
Yep.
You want it to be pretty uniformly yellow too, right, Laura?
Yeah, like I'll hold it up carefully and gently. There we go. So you can see
I see some cooking happening. This makes me very happy.
So I've got some nice bubbles in there. There we go. So I'm gonna check my butter again. Looking good. I like to just kind of swish mine around a little bit. Just make sure nothing's sitting in one spot too much.
If you're wanting to be sorry, wow, I have words. You can also use a spoon to do your butter. You don't need to swirl the pan around if you're concerned about swishing it around. So
I like to live adventurously.
Laura, we have a question in the chat.
Fantastic.
You know what year or years this pudding would have been created?
Can you pop back to the page with the original recipe on it? Because I believe that actually does have the date of publication for this particular recipe. As I can't recall off the top of my head the exact year, but this kind of recipe was popular for quite a bit of the 18th century going into the 19th. So this is something, probably as early as the 1750s we can see, maybe even earlier than that. To be honest, I'm not sure how early this starts. There's some recipes that the Masons have that are really long time favorites by the time they're having them made for their table. And they continue to be popular, kind of like the black eyed peas that we talked about or peanuts that we talked about in a previous program. There's a lot of things that, they're not locked in on a particular time.
So we're looking at the recipe now, Laura, and we're looking at 1831 as a date.
Perfect.
For the particular edition of the cookbook that we used. The Virginia Housewife was first published in 1826. And we know that Ms. Randolph, I think by this point she is Mrs. Randolph.
I believe so, yeah.
She married someone with the same last name, so she didn't need to change it. But I know I have seen this recipe in an earlier cookbook as well.
A lot of 18th century recipes, recipe books include tons of puddings. But when we were looking at recipes, because we have so many choices, we happened to pick this particular one because we liked the arrangement of it. But yeah, you can absolutely go find really similar or identical recipes from earlier editions and earlier books.
Yeah, there have been studies done on the similarities and differences between different pie recipes across cookbooks, pie and pudding recipes. One I'm thinking about in particular, which is I would say a break point for people. You either love it or you hate it, and that's sweet egg pie.
Oh, yes.
And there are, I have seen as many as like 20 different recipes for it, and all of them are slightly different.
If you're really into this subject on sort of the evolution of recipes, there is a really fun book called Seeking the Historical Cook. I can't remember the author off the top of my head. Thank you. Yes. Oh, that's right. Karen Hess, of course. And it's a really cool book. It's not a giant book. It's a fairly small book. And it really does an interesting job of covering all, like, as someone who interprets, historical food culture, how Karen Hess went about breaking down all these recipes. And it's such a fabulous book. Now, before I get carried away talking about books, I am going to go ahead and add in my sugar. The butter is still melting a bit, so we're not quite there yet, but that's fine. So the sugar can be added now. So we've got our 1.25 cups. And I like to pour this in just a little bit at a time and mix it together just to keep it from clumping up and making nasty, balls of sugar in my egg. I just like to do it little by little. I just find it makes everything come together so much smoother.
I was hoping I would be able to pull Seeking the Historical Cook off the shelf, but apparently it's in my office and not in the library.
That's because we use it all the time.
I sure do.
It's one of my favorites. I come to that book over and over again. I have a personal copy at home.
Me too.
So that's one I definitely recommend. Karen Hess also has done a modern edition of Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, which is one of the most popular 18th century cookbooks. And so, yeah, Karen knows her stuff. So,
how's our egg beating going over there at home? Give me a thumbs up if it's going well. I can see somebody beating some eggs back there.
Unfortunately, I can't see everyone, so I rely on Lacey to tell me, read me things from the chat and tell me how things are going. So
I am always excited to see people cooking at home because that's exactly what we would love to have happen. All right, we have another question in the chat. Do you think raisins or currants would be good to add to this recipe? You have asked an amazing question, Karen. There are many, many recipes similar to this one, which do include what they call dried currants or dried raisins. And in the 18th century, it didn't necessarily mean currants or raisins. It meant some dried fruit. Sometimes they said dried fruit. Sometimes they said currants. Sometimes they said raisins. And there's lots of different things going on. But I see Laura, it looks like, has taken her butter off of the stove, off of the heat.
Correct. We want to let it cool off.
That's important, right? We want to let it cool off so we don't have what happen, Laura.
We don't want our eggs to cook too fast. We don't want to make scrambled eggs. So if we were to just drop them right in that butter with the temperature being really high, it would cook. If you've ever made scrambled eggs and you've preheated your pan and you've dropped your scrambled eggs into that mixture and it immediately starts to cook, no good. That's what we want to avoid here. Now I did realize I haven't put any of my nutmeg in here yet, so I am gonna put some nutmeg in here.
I think I gave you some news over there.
Yeah, because I could just dump this whole thing of nutmeg in, but I think that would be a bit strong. But instead, the recipe calls for about a teaspoon, so I've got essentially a teaspoon here. So I'm just gonna shuffle that on in and then mix it in really well. And if you wanted to sprinkle some on top, after it's done cooking, you could absolutely do that as well. So 18th century definitely has a nutmeg mentality of the more the merrier. So, you know, to taste is absolutely all right. If you like more nutmeg, feel free to throw it in. Got a couple little clumps of nutmeg here, so I'm giving this a real good stir to try to break up those clumps, make sure all of our nutmeg is nice and evenly distributed. And this is also giving a little time for that butter to cool off, which is what we want. And I'll hold up this mixture so you can see it's darkened a little bit now, thanks to that nutmeg.
Can you hold it a little closer to the camera, Laura?
Yeah, I was like, uh-oh, I'm too far. Let me move the butter.
There we go. It looks like your nutmeg's a little clumpy too.
It is a little clumpy, which
is that a problem?
Not necessarily. Like, you don't want it to be super clumpy, so I am kind of breaking up a couple of the larger clumps.
You're also gonna stir it some more once you mix the butter and the eggs together too, right?
Correct. So I'm not done stirring yet. But yeah, so like if you can break it kind of up against the side of the bowl just to kind of encourage those clumps to break up, definitely great. This really happened just because my nutmeg, when I put it in, had a couple clumps in there that I didn't notice until I was pouring. And so that was my own fault. So if you're pouring out of your container at home and it's all nice and even and smooth, you should be fine.
Or if you're grating fresh nutmeg, obviously not a problem at all.
Which is how they often were doing it in the 18th century. Nutmeg was typically shipped as the whole nutmeg, and so when it arrived to its destination, cooks would grate it over the food fresh rather than getting a little container of it like we do today, where it's already pre-ground for us. And fresh nutmeg is really lovely. All right,
Laura, I'm thinking about this a little bit. Did you also want to get your crust set up before you add your butter and eggs together?
I do. You know what? Yes, I do. So let me move some things real quick. Give myself a little room. And I feel like I have a very dramatic reveal of our pie crust. Because we did ours earlier. So the reason I have a cover on it is this is actually a wettened tea towel, and it kept the pie crust from accidentally drying out. Because it was a frozen pie crust puff pastry, so we wanted to let it thaw a little bit. We don't want it going in frozen. So I'm gonna arrange it nicely. And then if you are someone who likes to decoratively crimp your pie crust, you can do that. So I'm kind of arranging here. Now you want to make sure it's not too thin. So if you do have to do any slight pulling or tugging, make sure that you don't yank it too much or you'll get a hole in the bottom of your pie crust. And I'm going to do just some real simple little pleating is what I'm going to do on mine, because I think that looks real pretty. These are like little baby pleats too. So nothing too.
You do yours really differently. I like it. Everybody has their own method of crimping pie crust.
And that's kind of what I love about pie crust crimping, is like there is no 100% right or wrong way to do it. And like I'm not measuring the distance between my little crimped pleats here. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. So I think it gives
the way I learned how to do it, Laura, is I take a tiny little pinch off of the edge of the pie crust, not off, but I pinch my fingers together and I just run right next to the other, pinch and pull all the way around the edge of the pie crust. But I've seen some really cool ones where people stick one finger behind the pie crust and use the other hand, the first two fingers on the other hand, over that finger.
That's kind of how I do it. I feel like I do mine like I pleat fabric. Which is sort of ingrained. And then I can just kind of clean it up if I think anything looks like it needs a little bit of a touch up around. I can just kind of do some gentle fixing, but for the most part, it looks pretty nice and good. It's nice and flat on the bottom. It's touching the bottom of the pie pan, so I'm not going to get any weird pockets or anything. So that's just about perfect. Fabulous.
And I just want to pause for a second, before you do your next bit, and make sure if anybody has any thoughts or questions that they want to get addressed, that we do that. You guys who are cooking at home, you good? All right, seems like.
All right, so my butter should be cool enough now that I can add my egg and sugar and nutmeg mixture into it. And I'm gonna pour it on into the saucepan because we're gonna put this back over the heat.
And another way to do this, Laura is pouring hers in all at once. But if you're concerned that your butter might still be a little bit too warm, you can just whisk your butter while you're pouring your egg mixture in, and pour the eggs really slowly to make sure that they don't cook as they get mixed in.
Yeah, I was feeling pretty confident, but yeah, if you have any doubts at all, better to take it slow.
Yeah.
And then I put it back onto some heat, really low heat, but heat. And so what we're gonna try to do is thicken it a little bit. So let me tilt this so you can kind of see the viscosity of it right now. And so we're gonna bring it back up to heat. Like I said, low and slow though. We don't want to cook the egg too much. We just want it to get it to thicken a little bit. And you do want to keep it stirring. You don't want it to stick to the bottom. So that's important. Let's sit for just a minute.
And looking at this recipe, looking at you working on this, Laura, it's really easy to see why this recipe was something that was consumed by the Masons and not by other people in the 18th century, people who were farmers like Thomas Halbert, or enslaved like Nell here at Gunston Hall. They don't have the time to put to this.
No, and like that's one of the things that, we talked a little bit earlier about ingredients that make food luxury, but something else that makes food luxury is this time and the skills that go into making it. And people like the Masons owned enslaved cooks who were trained to do this kind of really expert cooking, and that was something that they did as a full-time job, that was something that they had to hone those skills, and they became incredibly skilled at cooking. That some of these enslaved cooks are equivalent to, chefs that we have today in restaurants in terms of their skill levels. And so the average, farm wife does not have the time to wait around cooking something like this that needs really constant attention, that might require special skills or tools. That's another thing, is having certain luxury food items that you need a really particular piece of equipment to make something. And so, yeah, it becomes really limited to people like the Masons who can afford to stock their kitchen with not only expensive ingredients and expensive equipment, but that they also own enslaved workers whose sole job is to go about preparing luxury food.
And so we've got that time element, we've got the sugar and the amount of butter, and of course we're taking some modern shortcuts. We are starting with pre-made pastry, which of course if you're making this at home and you want to make your own pastry, go for it. So we're taking some shortcuts to make this possible for our program today. But you can see why this recipe is something that not a lot of people consumed in the 18th century.
So this is definitely thickened up a little bit. It's not quite easy to see, but you can feel the difference in it. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to give it just another maybe like 30, 45 seconds, and then we're going to be pouring it into our plate. And something actually I'd added to the slideshow, I almost forgot I put it in there, is, quite often people do ask, how do they go about cooking things? And so I included a picture of the kitchen here at Gunston Hall, and how when we do modern cooking demonstrations using 18th century styles, how we would go about cooking something out there in this 18th century style kitchen. And so my coworker's gonna, there we go, pictures up so you can,
for you.
Yeah, so you can see I've drawn an arrow because I knew I wouldn't be able to point for you to the oven that they're using. So you do get ovens that are built in, and they're very nice permanent ovens where
They're built into
imagine
a wall or
like a pizza oven almost. Yeah, they're built into the wall, and you heat them up with wood, and then you pull all the wood and hot coals out, and then you can bake in there. But we don't have one of those today at Gunston Hall, so we use what is sometimes called a Dutch oven, where it's a cast iron. It's basically almost like a giant pot. If you've ever used like a Le Creuset pot at home, very similar to that, and then it has a lid on top that has a lip.
Yeah,
and
or
so
maybe
you're able to
if you have worked with scouts ever, either Boy or Girl Scouts, maybe you've cooked in a Dutch oven, except instead of putting our food directly into the Dutch oven itself, our pie pan, like the one Laura has in the kitchen today, goes into the oven with the coals on the top and the bottom.
Yeah, and so you can see in our setup there that we've got the coals on top, and there's actually coals underneath. And this is a more controlled way to cook than trying to do something directly over open flames. So the coals are a much more regulated temperature. And so that is, as you can see from that setup, we've got other things that are cooking on coals too, because it's a better way to do it.
Yep, and you can tell this one is a low and slow cook because the pile of coals is smaller and we've let them get cold. Whereas the pile of coals underneath this pot, we were boiling eggs. The pile of coals under this pot is red hot because we want to keep the temperature really hot to boil those eggs.
Yeah. And so that's just one kind of setup. Other kitchens had different setups. That just happens to be ours. But it gives you sort of a sense of what kind of things that they're working with historically rather than today in our modern kitchens. But it is time for us to use our modern ovens. So I have my oven preheated at 350, and it's been going for a little while now. And I'm going to pour our egg and butter and sugar mixture into the pie pan now. And I like to do this really kind of slowly and gently, just to make sure we don't overfill it. So use your eyeball. If it looks like it's going to be too much, you can always stop.
And if you're doing this at home, we are using a deep 9-inch pie pan. You can see we probably could have made our filling just a tiny bit bigger because we've got a little bit of gap here, just a tiny bit.
I'll move it a little closer, so hopefully it's a little more visible.
It's so yellow.
And I'm actually going to sprinkle just like a teeny bit more nutmeg on top. Just kind of do like a little sprinkle on top, because I'm really partial to nutmeg. I think it makes an excellent garnish for things. There we go.
One of our volunteers here at Gunston has feelings about how much nutmeg should be an ingredient in recipes, and she says if you think there's enough nutmeg, there isn't. Add more.
And I'm putting it on in.
So we did forget to mention we preheated our oven to 350 degrees. And we're putting this about in the middle of the oven. There it goes.
Just go real slow when you put it in because it is very liquidy. So this isn't like a cake where it's a real thick batter where if it sloshes a little, it's okay. This is going to slosh quite a bit. So go real slow and just real careful because you don't want to pour it all over the bottom of your oven.
Or you can do it Great British Baking style and you put your pie plate on the rack and then fill it. Whichever.
Yeah, I haven't thought of that. Now, you may be wondering, because, you know, we've been here for about a half hour and this needs to bake. In fact, I'm going to set my timer now for a half hour because it goes for about a half hour to 40 minutes. So I'm setting my timer for 30 minutes. And then at 30 minutes, we can, you know, you will check on your pie. But you may be wondering, well, we're not going to be together in another 30 minutes. So how do I know what my pie should look like? And the answer is we have made one for you to show you ahead of time. So let me go get it.
Firstly, we should also say, Laura, that your pie puffs. The pie should get really tall in the oven. All those eggs and all the air that you put in the eggs is going to make it puff really big. And then it's going to look something like this.
I just broke off a little bit of the pastry. Oh no.
You get to eat it.
There you go. So this is a half one. So you'll notice, number one, it's not as big as the other one. We only made like a half batch in a smaller pie plate with less butter, less eggs. We have everything. So you can do a half. If you don't have a big 9-inch pie plate, that's okay. You can make mini ones. This one came out of the oven about 45 minutes ago. Now, when it first came out of the oven, it had a little bit of a wobble to it, and that's something that we want to see. So when you go to take it out of the oven, it should not be fully solid. You should be able to shake it and see it kind of quiver.
You should basically just be able to touch the rack on the oven, and you'll see it shiver across.
Yeah, you don't want it to slosh. No sloshing, but
yeah,
wibbly, shivery, waddly, that's good.
We tried to catch that on camera this morning. I think I caught it just the tiniest bit too late. There's still a little bit of a wobble, but it's not quite as much of a wobble as you want to see when it's just coming out of the oven. Sorry, I have the live transcription on and I can't find my play button. All right. So here's our pie fresh out of the oven. It had been out of the oven for maybe 45 seconds. And Laura bounced it for me, and you can just barely see it wobbling in the center. This is a little too done. When you want it to have just a little bit more wobble than that when you bring it out of the oven.
So it'll look very light in color. Do not expect it to be really dark when you bring it out.
Laura made some test ones at home, which came out much darker. I made some at home and I only had brown sugar. So mine came out looking really dark. But it should be pretty pale. It can have a golden crust on top, but the end result when you slice into it should look something like this guy.
And this is the one I made at home. So you can see the top has kind of a nice, it almost caramelized just a little bit, but my oven rack was also a little bit higher than middle in my oven. So it was slightly closer to those top coils. So it just did the teeniest little bit of caramelizing. But you can see how very, very yellow it is on the inside.
And it's going to have a really dense, kind of sweet quiche texture to it. I have likened it to some extent to a, it's not quite, but almost like a pecan pie without the filling, or sorry, without the pecans.
Yeah. And if you're looking at your crust as well, the crust is golden brown around the edges. So that's another good way to tell, like, okay, like the crust is cooked, you don't want raw dough. So it's going to look different than you might think of when you think of a pudding or a pie in a modern context, but this is what it would look like. And, if the Masons had ordered this for a table where they were going to be entertaining people, they might have it garnished with powdered sugar on top. They may add small floral decorations to it to make it look dressier, as we're coming up on holiday times, they may use some fresh greenery or something like a little holly, just placed on top just to kind of make it look a little prettier. But yeah, it's not a super over the top looking dessert, but what makes it really luxury and really high end is the ingredients and the preparation of it.
Absolutely. So here's the real test, Laura. You got to taste it for us.
I know, I was going to say, I wasn't sure if you wanted to cut into this one, but I'm ready to do so. Let me grab me a plate.
And while Laura is doing that, if anyone has any thoughts or questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, or now's a great time to shout them out loud as well.
Trying to take like a fairly small one and try not to yank a giant piece of pie out of here. And of course I'm going to try to lift this out as carefully as I can. Is that looking
Oh,
beautiful?
it looks gorgeous. Can you hold it up to the camera for us?
Absolutely. I must never get things to pull out like quite that nice and neatly.
It looks really good.
Here we go.
You can see some of those speckles of nutmeg in there. Again, we made just a half recipe for this one that we were doing this morning. So the pie is not quite as full as what yours will be.
I feel like Vanna White, you know.
All right, Laura, let us know what it's like.
Yeah, I was gonna say now I get to actually do the taste test part. And I'm curious to see how it's different than my other pre-bakes. Okay, I did a better job on this one. Yeah, this one's better than the first one I made. My first one was a little bit eggy, so don't be surprised if when you try yours at home, you think like, wow, this is a ton of egg taste. This one came out better. I think I got the cook time right. So like I said, don't overbake, otherwise you will get a really strong egg taste. But yeah, this is delicious.
Err towards under baking. So if you're putting it in the oven, put it in for less than 30 minutes and then look at it. You'll know that it's done in part as well when the top has a full dome, because it'll rise from the edges first and then rise in the center. And like I said, you got that full dome and that little bit of wobble and it's done.
This is amazing. I'm really pleased with myself, to be honest.
Good job, Laura.
Yeah. Because like I said, my first one was one that came out where I was like, oh, okay, like this is, I can see the appeal of it, but it's not something I think I really want to bake again. And like this version of it, now that I've become more confident in myself, I'm like, oh yeah, I would totally bake this for people. Like if I had people coming over, like absolutely, I would give this a shot. So yeah, like 9 out of 10 here. I have room for improvement, but it's definitely a good recipe. So
I also think it would be really good with like a brandy sauce.
Yes.
That would be really awesome.
And even like if you wanted to do like it does make me wonder, because we had the person ask earlier about like raisins and currants. It does make me wonder, like, ooh.
I bet it would be really, really good if you did Zante currants and soak them until they're not quite as hard, because they're going to seep liquid and change the texture of your bake. But if you soften them first and then put them in, I think that would be really good.
And this is still warm as I tried it. Like it had been sitting for about, like I said, 40.
It's better when it's warm.
But yeah,
definitely
something to eat warm. But yeah, no, that is really good. Like
that's fantastic.
As someone who's eaten things on this program before that I've not been crazy about, like I'm not a big fan of okra, and I've eaten okra for y'all. So, you know, I make sacrifices for you. This is good. This is really good.
That's awesome.
I'm really pleased.
You're getting a crying happy face, Laura.
Oh, I'm so happy
laughing with tears running down your face.
You know, it's one of those things of when we do this program for, you know, visitors, you know, we do try to test cook at home. And part of the reason we test cook is because things don't always come out on our first try, that we test them, especially as we're translating old recipes. And so getting it to the point where we do go, oh, there it is. Like, that's the flavor. Like, that's the way that it should be done. It feels really good.
Somebody asked me recently what one of my recipes was that cratered, that didn't go well. And the very first bake of this one was really bad.
Mine at home of this one, I'm waiting for my father-in-law to try it. I have not told him what's in it yet. And like I said, it's okay. It's not terrible. It's perfectly edible.
Yours came out a lot better than mine, Laura, because mine, my butter and eggs separated and it was really gross. I had to throw it away.
I'm glad that, that did not happen with mine. Mine was just simply overbaked. So, but yeah, no, this one, we got it just right. I will say though, this morning, as we were doing this bake to have our Martha Stewart version where we could show you all what it looks like, I was watching it very carefully in the oven. I had set a timer, but I had also left the oven light on so I could watch it as it was cooking, and I could keep an eye on it and make sure that it didn't overcook. So
yeah, if you're a Great British Bake Off fan, this is a good one to be sitting on the floor watching the oven.
Yeah, if we had the kind of, you know, cute little like cooking tent, baking tent like they did, I would have been sitting on the floor watching it intently as, you know, the hosts were around me going like, how's it going, love? You know, so, but yeah, I would present this to Mary and Paul and be like, yes, please have that. Like, so yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the time. We've got about 5 minutes left
Yes.
in the official program. I want to take a few moments just to let you know that this is our last session of History in the Kitchen for this round. History in the Kitchen will be coming back in February of 2022, and at least one of our recipes is going to be another pudding. We're making chicken pudding, which is one of my favorites. And it's an interesting take on some leftovers. This is definitely a recipe that wants for leftovers. So keep an eye out for that one. And next week, December 15th, Laura, do you remember what December 15th is? Big day.
Ooh, big day. What is it, Lacey?
It is Bill of Rights Day. And some of you may know that George Mason was one of the very few people at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 who did not sign it. And he did not sign the Constitution because it did not have a Bill of Rights. But on December 15th, 1791, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. So we'll be talking about 10 things you should know about George Mason and the Bill of Rights at 1 o'clock on our YouTube page. I'll put the link in the chat for that in just a minute. That wraps up our programs for 2021, but we will be back with more virtual and in-person programs, starting with History in the Kitchen, but also look out for an archaeology symposium, look out for a spring festival, Declaration Day, and summer Saturdays. So I am going to take a few moments and turn off the recording so that if anyone has any questions they would like to shout out at us but don't care to be on the recording, you can do so. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us for History in the Kitchen, and we'll see you next time.